The 90s brought a ton of adventure games to the PC, even some of the biggest of which have become forgotten over time. I maintain lists of games that I want to cover for this channel, which always feel like they're getting exponentially longer, much faster than I can make my way through them, and when I came across Broken Sword, Shadow of the Templar on that list, I was immediately struck by that sort of, oh, that game feeling that you get when you remember something that you haven't thought about in a long time, because despite having almost completely memory hold this game before that moment, the way it opens with a clown bombing had certainly made an indelible impression on me that immediately resurfaced on just seeing the title. Broken Sword belongs to something of a middle era, the same era that games like Curse of Monkey Island belong to. We're well out of the sprites era of adventure games, the early days of titles like the first two Monkey Islands and the first collection of Sierra's Quest games, but we're also not yet to the forced 3D era of games like Grim Fandango that would end up kinda killing the genre for a little while, despite how good they were. We're sort of in this really great era of incredibly well-drawn and animated art. The goal here was almost to make animated movies, which were very much experiencing their own renaissance at the same time with the introduction of new computer-assisted animation techniques. It's important to note the alternative approach to adventure games that was also incredibly popular at the time. Full motion video, or FMV games, which were the alternative to these beautifully drawn 2D graphics and used recorded video that was shot very similarly to the same way you would shoot a TV show. Granted, that video was then presented at what we would today consider a terrible resolution and quality. Because of these issues, these days it's easy to go back and pick games like Broken Sword as the obvious graphical winners, but the reality of using real video with real actors was a huge drawback then, and the inherent limitations of the FMV format, where every action had to be pre-recorded, matched up well with the conventions of point-and-click adventure games, where the player never really has direct control and only has a limited set of actions. Broken Sword, from its first moment, though, seems to very clearly draw a line between itself and those games, with its incredibly exaggerated cutscene animation style, which does cause the game to stumble a little tiny bit on the art front, because there's a huge disconnect between this animation style and the one that the in-game graphics have, and the animation style of the pre-rendered cutscenes looks great, but just does not gel at all. They're much less purposeful and what some would maybe even call over-animated. As a style, I think it works pretty well for what they're going for, but there's still a bit of a shock every time you see a cutscene and then go back to gameplay. The cutscenes, however, are few and far between, so this generally isn't an issue you're going to run into a whole bunch. For the most part, when it comes to its visual style, Broken Sword does manage to absolutely nail what it's going for from the very start of that opening cutscene. And it isn't just in its great art that Broken Sword reminds me of the animated films of the era. It also has some really great voice acting, especially for a video game of the time, and especially given the sort of acting performances you'd see in FMV games. And it also has an engaging story with an intriguing mystery. It manages to fit in plenty of comedic moments and doesn't make the mistake of taking itself too seriously, another hallmark of its filmic contemporaries. The game is also quite approachable for people who have never played an adventure game before, with mostly well-crafted and grounded, sensible puzzles that work within the world instead of requiring wild, out-of-the-box solutions that seem custom-crafted to force you to call a hint line. Some are a bit more difficult, but very few of them are on the same level of frustrating as you might expect from this era. People who have played this game before, of course, are screaming at their screens right now. And yes, there is one particularly infamous exception to this: the goat puzzle, which is, in fact, so infamous that it has its own dedicated Wikipedia page. But I honestly think part of the reason it is so infamous is because the rest of the game's puzzles generally work well enough and make sense in the world that this one isolated puzzle really, really stands out. As previously mentioned, Broken Sword almost immediately opens with a clown bombing the cafe that your main character, George, an American tourist, is eating at. In the grand American tradition of getting involved with things they have no reason to get involved with, George almost immediately meets and begins assisting a French photojournalist, Nicole. In the director's cut, the game begins much more slowly, with a meeting that turns into a murder, from the perspective of Nicole, which I frankly think is a much worse start to the game with regards to pacing. And we'll get into more of the reasons I don't love the director's cut later, but I thought this was a good time to mention that. If your game doesn't start off with a clown immediately blowing up a cafe, you are unfortunately playing the director's cut. After spending some time in Paris investigating that initial cafe explosion, you begin to branch out and travel to a number of different locations across Europe, with Broken Sword regularly taking advantage of the usual adventure game trope of returning to specific locations multiple times with new items in order to use those items to unlock some new area or finally solve a puzzle that you came across a few hours ago. Much like other games of its era, it can be quite tedious to navigate these different environments, however, as it is missing modern luxuries like the ability to quickly move from screen to screen without waiting for animations to play out, something I've found I've gotten very used to in modern point-and-clicks. However, Broken Sword also sets itself apart from other games of its era by managing to keep you engaged with the story throughout, instead of kind of alternating back and forth between plot and puzzle like many of the other games of its time would. For much of the game's runtime, I was very interested in figuring out exactly what was going on, in covering the vast conspiracy in front of me, which very quickly evolves from a simple clown terrorist to involve ancient conspiracies like the Knights Templar, and a rapidly expanding and evolving cast of characters, all involved in a number of different ways. However, I did find the ending quite unsatisfying. It wraps up the dangling plot threads well, and has a few last exciting reveals to show you, but it leans into the mysticism a bit too hard for my liking, especially given the suddenness of its turn into the realm of the magical after the rest of the game was very grounded in reality. But I digress. Just since the game ends on a bit of a sour note, it doesn't manage to lessen the rest of it for me, and Broken Sword is a truly fantastic game that still stands the test of time. Now, earlier, I alluded to the existence of the director's cut in how the game begins, and you should know if you plan to play Broken Sword, that's generally what I'm recommending you play. The original version of the game, not the director's cut you find in most stores, which makes some highly questionable changes to the game since the director's cut was originally made to target the Wii and DS, and thus a more family-oriented audience. It did work out for them, as Broken Sword saw a bit of a renaissance when it was released on those Nintendo platforms in 2009, but these are not the versions to play, as they saw significant changes made in order to better fit Nintendo's family-friendly image and to ensure a more favorable rating in order to achieve greater sales numbers. And to be sure, this seemed to work, and it did bring a whole bunch of new fans into the franchise, but I highly recommend that you play the original instead. Generally, I find the original cut far better, though the director's cut does manage to make some positive changes, including a fix to the infamous goat puzzle. Most places you'll buy the director's cut do include the original cut of the game as a bonus, so it's still quite easy to get your hands on and works very well in ScummVM. And in fact, most storefronts have likely already bundled it with a copy of ScummVM anyway. This accessibility, combined with its very low price on digital storefronts even before sales bring it down even further, make this game one that I think every fan of adventure games should check out if they never have before.